1860s cotton fields, when enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset under threat of whip-picking cotton that enriched plantation owners while receiving nothing but brutal treatment, representing the agricultural system that built Southern wealth through human bondage and made cotton America's most valuable export on the backs of people treated as property, capturing the backbreaking labor that sustained an economy based entirely on systematic exploitation and violence that maintained racial hierarchy through generations of inherited enslavement. 1860s auction blocks, when families were torn apart as children were sold away from parents and spouses separated forever to maximize profits for slave traders, representing the complete commodification of human beings whose relationships and bonds meant nothing compared to economic value. Capturing the moment when capitalism's logic of profit maximization reached its most horrific extreme as the domestic slave trade that continued after international trafficking was banned, destroyed families to meet demand for labor in expanding cotton regions. 1860s plantations, when massive disparity between owner's mansion and slave quarters revealed the wealth extraction that slavery enabled as enslaved people lived in dirt floor shacks while their labor built opulent estates, representing how extreme inequality was maintained through violence and legal systems that treated humans as property, capturing the physical manifestation of systematic exploitation, where every luxury in the big house was paid for with stolen lives and labor of people denied all humanity and compensation. 1860s plantation forges, when enslaved blacksmiths created tools and equipment using skills that would have earned them prosperity in freedom, but under slavery meant only increased value to owners who profited from their expertise, representing how bondage stole not just labor, but the fruits of talent and craftsmanship, as enslaved artisans created wealth they could never own, demonstrating that slavery robbed people of economic agency, regardless of their skills or capabilities, since all production belonged to masters. 1860s plantation laundry, when enslaved women spent endless hours washing clothes by hand in exhausting domestic labor that maintained the comfort of white families while destroying the bodies of workers who received no compensation or recognition, representing the invisible household slavery that enabled Southern gentility as wealthy families' leisured lifestyle depended entirely on brutal exploitation of enslaved domestic workers whose own families and needs were completely disregarded, capturing how slavery pervaded every aspect of daily life, from fields to kitchens to laundries. 1860s plantation fields, when overseers on horseback with whips enforced labor through constant threat of violence as surveillance and punishment maintained the control system that kept enslaved people working despite receiving nothing but brutality, representing how slavery required continuous violence because people naturally resisted bondage and would escape or rebel without systematic terrorism, demonstrating that the entire system depended on fear and physical punishment, since no rational person would accept enslavement without coercion that made resistance seem more dangerous than submission. 1860s slave quarters, when cramped dirt floor shacks with minimal furnishings housed multiple families in conditions designed to maintain bare survival while preventing any comfort or dignity, representing how housing itself was a tool of oppression as inadequate shelter reinforced enslaved people's dehumanized status, capturing the deliberate deprivation that characterized every aspect of slavery, from food to clothing to shelter, as owners provided only minimum necessary to keep workers alive and productive while denying all humanity and comfort. 1860s tobacco fields, when enslaved children worked alongside adults, learning agricultural labor before they could read, because childhood was stolen by a system that viewed even young people as economic units to be exploited, representing how slavery destroyed family structures and normal development as children became workers as soon as they could be useful, capturing the generational nature of bondage, where people were born into slavery and their children inherited their enslaved status, creating permanent underclass maintained through violence and law. 1860s cotton gins, when dangerous machinery processed harvests through labor of enslaved workers who received no safety protections, as owners cared only about production regardless of injuries or deaths, representing how industrial technology combined with slavery to increase exploitation as mechanization demanded more raw material, creating greater pressure for cotton production that intensified field labor. Demonstrating that technological progress under slavery meant only greater suffering for enslaved people, whose labor-fed machines that enriched owners while endangering workers. 1860s forced marches, when enslaved people in chains were relocated to meet labor demands, as internal slave trade moved hundreds of thousands from older states to new cotton regions, destroying communities and families, representing how slavery's economics required constant movement of human property to most profitable locations, without regard for people's relationships or attachments, capturing the brutal reality that enslaved people could be sold and relocated at any moment, as owners' financial interests determined their fates and destroyed any stability or community they might build. 1860s patrol system, when overseers' houses and guard dogs represented the elaborate control infrastructure required to maintain slavery through surveillance and violence, as enslaved people constantly monitored and punished for any resistance, demonstrating that bondage required massive investment in oppression apparatus because people naturally sought freedom and would escape or rebel without systematic terror, capturing how slavery's economics included not just productive labor, but extensive costs of maintaining control through violence that white society willingly paid to preserve racial hierarchy and economic exploitation. 1860s secret gatherings, when enslaved people held religious meetings in woods, risking severe punishment to maintain spiritual life and community that owners tried to destroy, representing the resistance and humanity that survived despite systematic dehumanization, as enslaved people created spaces for dignity and hope, capturing how even under total oppression, people found ways to maintain identity and culture through practices that sustained them psychologically and spiritually, demonstrating that slavery could never completely destroy human spirit, though it tried through every means of physical and psychological violence. 1860s rice plantations, when enslaved workers labored in swamp conditions, facing disease, snakes, and drowning, as low country agriculture was so deadly that owners calculated life expectancy in years of profitable labor before workers died, representing how some plantation regimes were essentially death sentences, as brutal conditions killed workers who were then replaced with newly purchased enslaved people, capturing the extreme of slavery's logic, where human lives were purely economic calculations and premature death from work conditions was accepted cost of production that owners simply compensated by buying more workers. 1860s sugar harvest, when enslaved people cut cane in backbreaking labor under brutal conditions, as sugar production demanded intense seasonal work that destroyed bodies through repetitive strain and dangerous cutting tools, representing how different crops created different forms of exploitation, with sugar among the most brutal, as harvest pressure meant workers labored to exhaustion during crucial cutting season, demonstrating that slavery's specific horrors varied by agricultural product, but all shared the fundamental violence of forcing people to work through threat of punishment while denying all humanity and compensation. 1860s plantation kitchens, when enslaved domestic workers prepared elaborate meals for white families while their own rations were minimal, and they faced constant supervision and potential punishment for any perceived failure, representing household slavery that placed workers in intimate proximity to owners, creating different but equally oppressive conditions as domestic servants navigated complex power dynamics while performing exhausting labor, capturing how slavery pervaded private spaces, with violence and exploitation continuing inside homes where enslaved women faced both labor demands and sexual vulnerability from masters with total power over them. 1860s punishment tools, when branding irons, whips, and chains represented the violence required to maintain slavery, as physical torture was systematic rather than exceptional, since bondage could only be enforced through terror, demonstrating that slavery was an inherently violent system that required regular brutality to prevent resistance and escape. Capturing the instruments of torture that were normal tools of plantation management, as owners and overseers routinely inflicted severe physical punishment to maintain control over people who naturally sought freedom and would resist or flee without constant threat of violence. 1860s scarred backs, when photographs documented the severe whipping injuries that enslaved people endured as evidence of slavery's brutality that owners tried to hide from northern critics, representing how violence was central to bondage, with whipping used as regular punishment for any perceived disobedience or failure to meet work demands, capturing the permanent physical evidence of systematic torture that marked bodies of people who survived slavery's violence, demonstrating that the system inflicted severe injuries as routine enforcement rather than rare extremes, since controlling enslaved people required continuous threat and application of brutal force. 1860s slave pens, when urban holding facilities confined people awaiting sale in crowded cages, treating humans like livestock, as slave trading infrastructure made commodification of people visible in city centers, representing how slavery's economics required elaborate systems for buying and selling human beings, with markets and holding areas where people were displayed and evaluated like animals, capturing the complete dehumanization of bondage, as enslaved people were stripped, examined, and sold to highest bidders in transactions that treated them as property rather than humans with any rights or dignity. 1860s. Brief rest periods, when exhausted enslaved workers' faces showed the physical toll of constant labor, as even moments of pause revealed the human cost of system designed to extract maximum work through minimum subsistence, representing how slavery destroyed bodies through overwork and inadequate food and shelter, as owners calculated optimal exploitation that kept workers productive while spending least possible on their maintenance, capturing the visible suffering that daily labor inflicted on people whose health and well-being meant nothing compared to their economic value as property. 1860s plantation bell, when time control system regulated every moment of enslaved people's days from wake up through work to sleep, as owners claimed total authority over workers' schedules, eliminating any autonomy or personal time, representing how slavery extended beyond labor to claim complete control of people's lives and movements, as even rest periods were granted by masters rather than chosen by workers, demonstrating that bondage meant loss of all self-determination, as enslaved people could not control when they woke, ate, worked, or slept, since owners directed every aspect of existence. 1860s forced construction, when enslaved people built levees, roads, and infrastructure that enabled southern development while receiving nothing from improvements their labor created, representing how slavery extracted not just agricultural production, but engineering work that developed regions' physical infrastructure at no cost to white society that benefited from projects built through unpaid forced labor, capturing how bondage stole multiple forms of labor from people who created lasting value while being denied any ownership or compensation for work that enriched others and built wealth for generations of white families. 1860s restraint devices, when iron collars and leg shackles physically marked enslaved people's status, while preventing escape attempts through painful restrictions on movement, representing the elaborate physical control methods that slavery required as owners invested in restraint technology to prevent flight and punish resistance, demonstrating that maintaining bondage demanded not just violence, but mechanical systems of control that marked bodies and restricted freedom through devices designed to cause suffering while preventing people from exercising natural desire to escape oppression and seek freedom. 1860s Underground Railroad, when secret networks helped enslaved people escape to freedom through elaborate system of safe houses and guides who risked everything to assist fugitives, representing the organized resistance to slavery, as both black and white abolitionists created infrastructure for liberation that saved thousands from bondage, capturing the courage of people who escaped despite enormous dangers and those who helped them, defying laws that made assistance to fugitives serious crime, demonstrating that slavery faced constant resistance from people who rejected the system through escape and those who supported their bids for freedom. 1860s Emancipation, when newly free people celebrated liberation after generations of bondage as Union victory, and 13th Amendment legally ended slavery throughout United States, representing the culmination of enslaved people's resistance, abolitionist activism, and military defeat of Confederacy that finally destroyed the institution, capturing the joy of people experiencing freedom for first time in their lives. Though challenges of Reconstruction would reveal how difficult it would be to achieve true equality after centuries of systematic oppression that left deep scars on American society, lasting long after legal bondage ended.